Modern-day mermaids are known for three things: their musical talents, for guiding sailors out of dangerous waters, and their tendency to create questionable crushes.
But you don't think sharks are sexy, do you?
No? Wait a minute, what was a little mermaid?
But the mermaids that you and I are familiar with, who show up in our cartoons and children's books, are a heavily sanitized simplification of their feathered and fish-tailed ancestors. These supposedly innocent ocean maidens are the descendants of soulless spirits, demons who lured seafarers to their doom. And today I am breaking down the history, mythology, and folklore that contributed to their evolution. But first, I gotta warn ya that mermaid lore is as deep as the ocean floor, and you might not like what you find at the bottom. Now, it's a misconception that all it takes to be a mermaid is to have a fishtail with a human body. But I'm here to tell you that... Hold on a second. So that is all it takes to be a mermaid? Well, I wish you told me that sooner. For real though, if you look at the definition of mermaid in Webster's dictionary, all it says is a fabled marine creature with the head and upper body of a woman and the tail of a fish. And naturally, the etymological roots are even more vague. It's a combination of the Middle English words mere, meaning sea or ocean, and maid, meaning girl. So, ocean girl. There are also ocean boys, or mermen, I guess you'd call them.
Nobody's ever called me a merman before.
But they usually play second fiddle to mermaids and tend to only show up in stories where mermaids live in a society of mer-people, so we're focusing on mermaids today. Middle English was primarily spoken in, you guessed it, Middle Age England, and the earliest use of the word mermaid in writing can be found in a Geoffrey Chaucer poem called The Nun's Priest's Tale, written in 1390. But just because they coined the term mermaid doesn't mean they invented the idea of a fish-female hybrid. Figures like this existed in cultures all over Europe, Asia, and Africa. They just went by different names, might have looked different, or even acted entirely different. But if all we care about is fitting that broad definition of half female, half fish, then the oldest example of a mermaid is the Syrian fertility goddess Atargatis. And Diodorus Siculus, the ancient Greek historian born in 1st century Sicily, is credited with capturing the most detailed description of her. But I would hardly call it detailed. All he says is that she has the face of a woman and otherwise the entire body of a fish. Unless they're talking about his interpretation of her backstory where Aphrodite curses her with an infatuation for a mortal, she lets him get her pregnant, then out of shame tries to kill the baby. And then out of shame for that, throws herself off a cliff only to be transformed into the fish person that you see before you. As we established though, all of these examples existed independently of mermaids, and it's pretty unlikely that they had any influence on mermaid lore. Some experts theorize that Atargatis must be related to England's mermaids because she looks so much like one, but by that logic, Gunther would have descended from seals instead of wolves. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving, so we'd have to know more about her to say for sure. But that information just doesn't exist. And speaking of deceiving appearances, the legacy of mermaids goes back even further than Diodorus's writings to one of the most well-known and studied of the ancient Greek myths. But it may not be the one you think. Because if you're anything like me, you assumed that mermaids descended from, or were at least cousins to, the sirens in Homer's Iliad. Both have reputations for being kinda hot fish women that lure sailors to their death, so the connection is about as obvious as it gets. Only, sirens weren't fish women. They were birds. I'm sure that some of you watching are rolling your eyes at my naivete, but it'd been so long since I read the Odyssey that I honestly forgot that sirens don't look like mermaids at all. If you look at the artwork from ancient Greece, like the vases and plates, you'll see that they were exclusively depicted as part female, part bird, with the precise ratio evidently being up to interpretation. Meanwhile, poets like Ovid and Pseudo-Apollodorus describe sirens as having the feathers and legs of birds. I know I'm not the only one who's made this mistake though, because when you Google image siren mythology, the results are split between avian and aquatic depictions, and in my opinion, it's reasonable to assume that sea nymphs like sirens would look fish-like. Edwardian era artists evidently agreed with this point too. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the conflation of sirens and mermaids started happening, but this manuscript from 1754 calls what is obviously a fish lady a siren, and then you have Herbert James Draper's 1909 painting that depicts Odysseus and company being lured by mermaid-like beings. So by this point, the terms were clearly being used interchangeably. Not to mention, there are legends that long before this, there was more than one famous seafarer who encountered mermaids during their travels, but more on them later. Despite sirens not actually inhabiting the ocean, or looking like they do, their role in the Odyssey was no doubt influential in how people perceived aquatic entities. But as I alluded to earlier, this isn't the only significant myth in the mermaid's legacy. More marine deities known for their danger and mystique are the naiads of Greek myth, who occupy bodies of fresh water as opposed to seawater. They show up in the Argonautica, which tells the story of the hero Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece, and they lure one of his companions, Hylas, into a lake, and he is never seen or heard from again.
Ooh, spooky poopy.
This isn't to say that all of the aquatic entities in Greek myth were dangerous. In fact, many marine deities existed solely to protect sailors and fishermen, like Glaucus, who happened to be half fish himself. But he was a merman, so we don't give a shit about him. When Glaucus wasn't available, the Nereids filled in as protectors and guides. Not to be confused with the similarly named naiads mentioned a moment ago, the Nereids lived in the ocean and, according to Pliny the Elder, looked exactly like normal women, but covered head to toe in scales. These sea nymphs personified various facets of the sea, like the salty brine, sand, rocks, and sea foam. And like modern-day mermaids, they were often depicted mingling with marine life, riding dolphins or hippocampi and holding fish in their hands. They also show up in the Argonautica to lead Jason and the Argonauts through rock-filled waters that would have destroyed their ship. So you can already see the two sides of the modern-day mermaid's reputation taking shape in these ancient myths. While Greek mythology had a variety of humanoid aquatic entities, they weren't all good or bad, and this dichotomy made its way into the mermaid lore of Middle England, where their intentions depended on the setting, the story, and storyteller, who might be sharing an old folk tale, warning his flock, or recounting his own encounter with the fabled femme fish fatales. First though, if you've watched my personal updates, then you already know that I have had a lot of doctor's appointments over the past couple of years. And at the start of my medical mystery adventure, it was genuinely maddening trying to find specialists who were in my network, within driving distance, and actually had enough availability that I could squeeze in an appointment before the apocalypse. That's where ZocDoc came through to save my sanity, and this was years ago before they were even a sponsor. ZocDoc is a free, life-changing app and website that helps you find and book high-quality doctors in your network, using their database of 150,000 providers across all 50 states so you can find your perfect match. They've got almost all the medical fields covered: dermatology, dentistry, primary care, eye care, orthopedics, endocrinology, and you're even able to choose between in-person or virtual visits, whatever fits your schedule the best. Before using ZocDoc, there were so many times where I'd call a doctor's office to schedule an appointment just to be put on hold for 20 minutes or find out that the scheduling office closed early that day. ZocDoc is available to book appointments instantly whenever you need it. Whether you cut your finger making a midnight snack or you're doom scrolling your symptoms at 3 a.m. like I do, They make the process so easy that there is genuinely no reason to put off your doctor's appointments anymore. Just go to ZocDoc.com/Jon Solo to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/Jon Solo. This message is sponsored by ZocDoc. So far, I focused solely on the mermaids' mythical origins, but the problem is, even the myths that we discussed referenced events that supposedly happened hundreds, if not thousands of years before they were written down. While the majority of ancient Greeks believed Nereids and Naiads and Sirens existed at one point, there's no telling how common it was to think they were still around during the Iron Age, or if they'd already evolved into something that closer resembled mermaids. And while we know for a fact that sailors shared stories about seeing mermaids on their travels, the closest thing that we have to a first-hand account from one of those sailors is Chris Columbus's journal, but that wasn't written until the 1400s. So there is this huge middle chunk of the timeline where we know the general public, or at least seafaring societies, believed in some kind of ocean-dwelling female entity. We just don't know the specifics, and we have to figure them out one piece at a time. So when I started researching for this episode alongside our resident folklorist Jack Daly, who you should totally subscribe to on YouTube by the way, I asked what traits and behaviors are mermaids known for, because those are probably a good indicator of how people thought about them back in the day. And the first trait that came to my mind was their association with music. Some of you might have been expecting me to just jump to them drowning sailors because I'm Mr. Morbid Curiosity, but in my defense, my older sister was obsessed with the Part of Your World song from The Little Mermaid, and my daughter's got this board book about some mermaids getting ready for a concert that we read at least twice a day. So that's right where my mind goes. It's a pretty cool book though. Look, you can make her change outfits. Listen, I'm really tired. Similar to their association with danger, I think the mermaids' musical talent partially stems from their siren ancestors, who were known for making such beautiful music that it could put the most stoic of Greek kings into a trance. More evidence of this lies in that Chaucer poem I mentioned earlier. Written in 1390, the character references mermaid singing talent as it's described by the Physiologus, an even older text that interpreted the natural world through the lens of Christian morality. Plants, stones, and animals, both real and imaginary, although they didn't realize these animals were imaginary. And while Chaucer says the Physiologus describes mermaids as good singers, all of the translations opt to call them sirens, not mermaids, meaning the terms have been used interchangeably since the 14th century at the latest, which actually segues nicely to their second most well-known attribute, danger. And there's more to this than just the siren and naiad angle I mentioned earlier, although it is all connected. Because while sailors had been warning each other about the alluring calls of women on the water for millennia, it wasn't until Christianity came around that mermaids, sirens, and everything in between went from simply being dangerous to downright demonic. This was the case with a lot of the mythical creatures of religions past, though. If the church didn't understand a pagan tradition and couldn't find a way to rebrand it as their own, like they did with the unicorn and phoenix, they usually labeled it as evil, sinful, or a machination of Satan. And they told people to avoid such temptations like I avoid the street corner that your mother works on.
Move this man!
Their warnings about mermaids specifically were both literal and allegorical. There was, of course, the very real threat of dying at sea should you try to follow one and wrap your ship around some rocks, but they also symbolized temptation and sexual danger. A siren trying to lure Odysseus off the path is like a temptress seducing a married man. Only instead of wrecking his ship, he'd wreck his marriage and probably the rest of his life along with it. He would die a different kind of death. The allure of mermaids, along with their roots in pagan tradition, meant that in the public eye, mermaids could not only kill you, they could contaminate your soul and ruin your chances at everlasting bliss in heaven. So fellas, for the literal love of God, don't try to stick it in one.
I'm not going to.
Good, because if you did, you would rip your dick off.
What I find funny, though, is that despite all these warnings and legends about mermaids being dangerous, the two most famous mermaid encounters that we have on record are as uneventful as it gets. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in 1493, he was still sailing it. One of his journal entries, dated January 9th, 1493, mentions that one of his admirals claimed to have seen mermaids on more than one occasion. Apparently, those mermaids weren't as beautiful as they were in paintings he'd seen, but they did have a somewhat human face. Sounds like me trying to give your mom a compliment.
You can't keep getting away with it!
A little over 100 years later, John Smith also wrote about seeing a mermaid. Except that he didn't. Yeah, man, while Smith's first-hand account of witnessing a green-haired mermaid swimming in the ocean has been widely circulated through 19th century literature, folklore, and the internet, the truth is the passage is a complete fabrication.
It's false. It never happened. It's a total fabrication.
Historian Vaughn Scribner did some serious detective work and determined the original author of John Smith's mermaid encounter was none other than Alexander Dumas, the guy who wrote The Three Musketeers. In an article dated September 29th, 1849, and published in a newspaper called the Gazette of the Union, Dumas evidently made up the story about John Smith writing about his mermaid encounter to legitimize the mermaid story he had written. Which is funny because now we know that Smith was a notorious liar, so even if he did claim he saw a mermaid, I would trust him about as much as I would trust Darth Vader to babysit. I'm getting sidetracked though. As effective as the church's campaign against the old ways was, there came a point a few centuries later where Europe's citizens started to get curious about the abandoned beliefs. Which makes sense. After the Age of Enlightenment that went real strong from 1687 to 1789 and promoted things like logic, reason, empirical evidence, and the scientific method. In other words, when people started fact-checking reality and citing their sources, came the Romanticism movement, which you might remember also played a role in the messed up origins of fairies that I covered a few weeks ago. To paraphrase Clara McGoffin's excellent blog post that I cited in that episode, Romanticism emerged in the late 1700s, and people got obsessed with folklore and the mystery of nature. The Age of Enlightenment was so grounded in raw reality that the public started yearning for the fantastic, the mythical, the stuff that couldn't be explained with science or mathematics. By the late 1800s, folklore was established as a field of study and taken up by lawyers, scholars, and even clergymen who became the first people to record their country's folk traditions in writing. Now I gotta mention, there were some crafty entrepreneurs that found new ways to capitalize and monetize this newfound interest, like P.T. Barnum, who displayed a supposed mermaid skeleton in his museum. And I am not exaggerating when I say this thing is straight up nightmare fuel, made worse by the fact that advertisements showed a traditional sea maiden, not a baby monkey carcass sewed to a fish, which is what this was. Hilariously, Barnum crafted an entire fictional backstory for this thing, like he did with a lot of the oddities on display, and he claimed it was caught near the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific and that it had previously been on display at the London Lyceum of Natural History, which didn't even exist. Now, to a certain extent, belief in mermaids persists to this day. You might be surprised by that, but it's understandable when you have trusted sources like Animal Planet airing very convincing mockumentaries that present mermaids like they're a newfound discovery.
Scientists aren't supposed to believe in fairy tales. And what we were looking at was a mermaid.
Bullshit!
They aired specials like this back in 2012 and 2013, and viewers bought into them hook, line, and sinker. Really? Nothing? Anyway, after these specials aired and Animal Planet enjoyed its highest viewership ever by lying its ass off to millions of people, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was forced to release a statement declaring that there was no new evidence that mermaids existed, in response to viewers bombarding them with calls wanting to know if the mockumentaries were legit. But even back in the 1800s, most people understood that mermaids were a product of myths and folktales told by sailors who spent most of their time at sea, starving, dehydrated, overworked, and lacking human contact. So they weren't the most reliable narrators. I say this confidently because theories attempting to rationalize what sailors like Columbus's admiral saw can be traced as far back as 1893. There's a footnote in a translation of Chris Columbus's journal by Clements Markham where he states matter-of-factly that what they really saw was a manatee, and he goes on to explain how a manatee's shape could be mistaken for a human's. At first, I thought that sounded ridiculous because how could anyone think that a manatee looks like a human? But when you think about the mindset that those sailors were in, and you consider some of the straight-up ogres that folks go home with after a few too many drinks, and it makes perfect sense.
It's disgusting!
But I'd be a madman and a dumbass if I went this whole episode without mentioning the most famous mermaid story of all time, The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, which introduced into literature the idea that mermaids don't have souls. For those unfamiliar with the story, it follows a little mermaid who's curious about the human world and wants more than anything to earn a human soul so she can ascend to heaven when she dies. Yeah, a little deeper than Disney's version. Andersen establishes that mermaids can live up to 300 years, but since they lack souls, there is no afterlife. Once they die, and the only way to prevent this was for a human to fall in love with her and pledge himself to her, effectively sharing his soul with her. When Disney adapted it, they simplified her desire for spiritual completeness, so she just wanted to be a human being and live a human life. But why did Andersen take away her soul in the first place? Where did that idea come from? Well, I might have to revisit The Little Mermaid's origins a second time, because while researching for this episode, we learned that Andersen was inspired by a German fairy tale called Undine, where a water spirit marries a knight so she can gain a soul. But there's no doubt that he was also heavily influenced by his Christian faith. Theologians as far back as 600 CE debated whether non-human beings like animals, fairies, mermaids, and other monstrous creatures had souls. And the consensus was, nah, they didn't. And in the 1500s, it was firmly established by Paracelsus's treatise that nature spirits like the Undine may resemble a human in every way except for their possession of a soul. So Andersen just followed the lore that was established by his faith. And when you think about it, it kinda makes sense that the mermaids of legend, and monsters like them, wouldn't have souls. That might be what allows them to commit such purely evil acts like luring sailors to their doom without regret or guilt weighing down their conscience. And while Andersen's mermaids are definitely not monsters who intentionally hurt humans, they do play a disturbing role in sailors' deaths. Because if they see a ship that's about to sink or in the process of, they will sing to the sailors about how great it is to live underwater so they won't be scared when they drown. Which in theory is nice, but the last thing that I want to hear while my lungs fill with salt water is some fish lady singing seductively in my ear that it's better down where it's wetter. Either be a Jamaican crab or get the hell out of here. Anyway, I think that Andersen's story was basically the best PR that mermaids could have asked for. Because while the tide had already started turning with the rise of Romanticism a few decades before he wrote The Little Mermaid, and the reverence that creatures like them were now being given, they still would have been seen exclusively as femme fatales, the oceanic equivalent of fairies like the Liananshi and La Belle Dame Sans Merci, who seduce men before sucking out their souls. But when he turned the Little Mermaid human, he turned her from something to fear to someone to cheer on. Someone you felt sorry for when she sacrificed her life at the end of the story. And once that version of a mermaid existed, There was no going back. Thanks to him, painters and poets, and the animators that came long after them, mermaids are now known for their grace, beauty, and fragility. They represent freedom, curiosity, and adventure, and this perception of them is now so entrenched in our culture that seeing them portrayed any other way is a subversion of expectations, and sometimes a messy one.
Oh, come on.